Hello, Hollywood Times fans. I'm Virginia Schneider, and I'm very happy to have our honored guest today, Gail Merrifield Papp. And Gail has written this amazing book, which I highly recommend. I don't think you can see the cover, but it's called Public Private: My Life with Joe Papp at the Public Theater. Gail is with me today. She is the widow of one of America's greatest, if not the greatest, theatrical producer in the United States. Joseph Papp was the founder of the New York Shakespeare Festival, which has produced free Shakespeare in New York City since 1956. In 1967, he launched the Public Theater, which is dedicated solely to new American work. And their original production was Hair. Joe Papp has been called the most important force in the English-speaking theater for the 20th century. Joseph Papp produced over 600 plays and musicals, which won more than 200 stage, film, and television awards. His lovely wife, Gail Merrifield Papp, was born in San Francisco to a family with a deep theatrical lineage. After joining Joseph Papp's New York Shakespeare Festival in 1965, she became director of new works of development for the Public Theater and was responsible for some of its best remembered productions, including The Normal Heart, for which she received a Human Rights Campaign Arts and Communication Award. She also worked on developing The Mystery of Edwin Drood, as well as many other productions, which I hope you'll discuss with us today, Gail. So thank you so much for being with us. I love to see you. It's so great.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here to see you.
Well, I loved Public Private, your memoir, My Life with Joe Papp at the Public Theater. Coming up in theater myself, I was fascinated with all the stories of actors, very famous actors who got their start at the Public Theater, like Raúl Juliá, James Earl Jones, Meryl Streep, and so many directors as well. And they were totally unknown. And Joe Papp was very much in favor of casting actors and directors of color and people from different ethnic backgrounds, which was very much ahead of its time. And this is the thing that I think is so shocking for many of us today. In 1965, we didn't do new American plays. We did classics, but we didn't experiment. He was the one that started producing plays by new American playwrights. So we have him to thank for not only free Shakespeare in a park, but also new voices in America. And I want to start out with one thing I think the thing that is most impressive, there's two things that are most impressive to me about this book. And one of them is your relationship with your husband, which I'll talk about later. The other one was just the moxie and the chutzpah and the bravado, the courage that Joe Papp had. And I encourage anyone to go on YouTube and hear him speak. He was like, there was no doubt and no hesitancy. And one of the stories that I loved was how he actually had to fight the New York Parks Commissioner, because the New York Times theatrical critic and the New York Parks Commissioner would not allow free Shakespeare in Central Park because, as the New York Times critic said, if you don't pay for something, then it's not worth anything, to that effect. So, and he had to go all the way to the New York Supreme Court to fight to get free theater in New York. So
it was amazing.
So what are some stories that I mean, to me, it's like there was just as much struggle as there was success.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
So tell us some of your stories like that.
Well, it was it's become almost a legend, at least in New York City, this sort of David versus Goliath struggle that Joe had in the early days. I came in and just kind of at the tail end of it, but when I started working there. But he was very passionate about free admission to the Shakespeare plays he was doing in the parks, and eventually he was doing them in Central Park. And the then Parks Commissioner was this very powerful figure named Robert Moses. I mean, he was way beyond a parks commissioner. He was just like a titan in politics at that time. And he felt that Joe should reimburse the Parks Department for the expenses that they had because he was doing Shakespeare on a platform in Central Park then. Well, Joe was willing to raise the money. He could go out and try to raise that money and reimburse the Parks Department, but he wasn't willing to charge people coming to see the plays. He wanted them to have free access. It was very important to him. So he refused to charge for tickets. And because the parks czar, Mr. Moses, felt that was not the thing that he wanted to see happen, he canceled Joe's permit to perform in the parks. Well, this unleashed the most amazing episode in New York City's history. Joe started a campaign. He had tremendous support from the public, because the public liked to have free access to Shakespeare's plays. So people began writing the newspapers. They began phoning into radio programs and so forth. And Joe published numbers of articles and so forth. He never got through to Moses personally, but already wrote him letters asking him to reconsider this. And so he was barred from the parks. So he filed a suit in the courts. It was a complicated basis for the suit. It was called a show cause order. And he lost initially in the courts, in lower courts. And then Mr. Moses countersued against Joe. Well, this was the most amazing thing. It was reported every single day in the city's newspapers, every single day, with alarming headlines like Shakespeare kicked out of park or things like that. But for Joe, it was a very principled and urgent thing for him. He really wanted to do these plays in the park where people come, they congregate, and they have access to these plays that he was doing. So he countersued, and although he lost in the lower courts, that seemed to be the final word on this matter. But he filed yet another suit. And, he was working from, a very humble base. He didn't have major donors or anything like that. He supported this enterprise by working as a stage manager in television. He had a day job that supported all this. He didn't have big donors. But anyway, he countersued. It finally got to the state Supreme Court, which was 5 judges who agreed to hear it before the summer season began, when Joe wanted to perform. And they handed down a decision that was unanimous in his favor, that the parks commissioner had been capricious and so forth and so on, and that Joe had a right to perform. So that was a great victory that put Joe's enterprise on the map, because it got so much attention in the press and people really rallied to it. So that was the kind of kickoff of his career in the theater. And eventually, I think, in retrospect, it really served his purpose, because his enterprise caught on with the public. They became immensely supportive of it, and he registered in the public consciousness of what he was doing. So that it eventually served his purpose, in other words, although it was very difficult at the time.
Well, there's several stories like that where I was so impressed with how much he fought for what he believed in. Yeah. And then, he buys this old the Astor Library that then had a history of being the Hebrew immigrant
Aid Society, yes.
Society for Jewish people that were fleeing the pogroms and Nazis in Germany.
Right.
So he raises millions of dollars, which and then he gets to the point where he goes, but he doesn't really know any playwrights or have any plays to put on in the building.
I know.
There's a great quote in the book, and he says, you've got a picture, you've reached this point where you finally secured the millions of dollars to buy this amazing building that was going to be razed. Right. And you included a picture in here of someone, like an 1880s picture of somebody leaping across two rocks in the Wisconsin dells and taking a leap of faith. And you quote Joe as saying, "By nature and habit, I feel most effective when I am dancing on the edge of a precipice."
Right.
I think theater and producing is so terrifying and so challenging anyway. What kind of man says something like that? What is that like?
Well, he was propelled by certain ideas, that he had. It started out with the free admission, and it became more inclusive, non-traditional casting, and it expanded from that. We moved into that marvelous building that was quite a wreck at the time, to expand free access to everybody that wanted to write or work in the theater. So he had these ideas, and he was propelled by the ideas. He wasn't propelled by things that a lot of other people might be propelled by as a producer. He wasn't interested in making money. He was interested in raising money, but not interested in making money himself. He actually had kind of a prejudice against commercial theater for numbers of years, although he eventually kind of found a way to accommodate that. But he was fired up by ideas and his conviction about them. And I don't know how to explain it otherwise, because the whole time I knew Joe and I was married to him and worked with him, it was his ideas that were the thing that motivated him day in and day out. Absolutely. He was possessed with these goals in the theater for the people that work in the theater and the people who come to it. He had a very deep sense of public service. He liked to serve people. He liked to take care of them. It was true just on a personal basis. If he heard about someone who was sick in the hospital, he'd go to the hospital to see them, without fail. He was there for people. And it was part of his nature. It was very generous and caring. Some people liked that, and other people didn't like it so much. But that was the way he was.
Well, I'm sure that a lot of times some people don't want to be given advice.
Yeah,
they're right, but
absolutely. People have very different reactions to him.
But you need someone like that. If you're a new playwright or new actor or new director, you need to be nourished. Honestly, you need support, especially in a city like New York.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Joe was rock solid in his support of the people that he produced. And I think part of that was because the way he had kind of the soul of an artist himself. And the way he expressed himself was through what he produced. It was very personal. He didn't produce, certainly, for the reason of making money, because it was a nonprofit organization. You have to raise the money for that. It's not money coming in. Also, all the theaters that he established in this marvelous building were small. The biggest one is 300 seats. Well, you don't make money off of theaters. That's not a good business plan for anything. So the thing that was so important to him was partly his own self-expression. I think, through what he produced and the people that he involved in the theater. That's what fulfilled him.
Mm. Why did you? I'm glad you decided to write this book now, because I knew the name, but I had no idea of the fascinating character of both you, of course, and your husband and what you went through. What made you decide to write this book now? And thank you for doing so.
Well, I think there are numbers of reasons. Uh, Partly, I think it was my reaction to what's going on in our contemporary times in this country,
Mhm.
which are challenging a lot of people, especially young people,
Mhm.
and are very difficult for the performing arts, certainly, and for the theater. And I felt that there was something in my experience with Joe uh, during the time that I write about, which is the 60s, 70s, 80s, right?
Mhm.
So I thought, well, there were lots of problems back then, and many of them are similar to what we have today, that are difficult situations. And I thought it was instructive how Joe dealt with them back then.
Mm.
And although times have changed, not everything is exactly the same. And we have a huge difference in how people communicate in the social media aspect of modern life. The way he went about dealing with very difficult situations, I thought was instructive and might uh, be a positive aspect for people to know about, to maybe adapt in some way for where they're handling problems now, especially in the theater.
You go into depth in several stories, which is why I highly encourage people read the book. But is there an example that you want to give of what you're speaking of how?
Well, I think that the main thing is that Joe came out of the Depression era. That's when he grew up. So he was very familiar with various forms of protest during the Depression. He came out of a poor family and so forth. So he understood that you have to organize, right? He was very practical in the way he went about something to try to solve a problem. It was true in the theater. It was true in a more broad social aspect. But the interesting thing is Joe never made any difference didn't see a difference between his artistic role as a producer and his social responsibility. They just wedded like this. They came together, and he didn't see any distinction between those roles. So uh, that was a tremendous source of positive energy in the theater that he founded. And the way he went about dealing with problems, starting with Robert Moses and going into the future, into some difficulties in the 1980s when there was a right-wing uh, movement against the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities and so forth. He went about it very practically. He started out organizing people that supported his position. He got them to write. He would speak to them. He published articles. He wrote op-ed pieces, the West Coast, East Coast, and he wrote to senators and congressmen, including those that weren't particularly supportive of his view. And he just kept at it. And it went on television, it went on radio. I'm sure he would have found a way to use the social media today in some constructive way. And he didn't let up. He just kept at it. He used to quote something about the way you preserve democracy is through eternal vigilance. uh, he had that streak in him that even if he lost one bout on an issue, he didn't give up. He kept at it. And so there was a remarkable constancy in him that was just part of his personality, for one thing, and also was part of his conviction of how you go about trying to change a situation. It was true within the artistic aspect of the theater too, because, like for instance, I write about hair.
I was going to bring that up. Yeah,
the whole process leading up to here. We'd been a Shakespeare-only organization up to then, and all of a sudden, all these hippies, many of them were cast off the street and so forth. And so the rehearsal period of Hair was like hair raising. It was like very disorganized and contentious, and people were writing memos and quitting right and left, and just like god awful. And I thought, oh my God, we're headed for a disaster. And the way Joe went about trying to resolve these issues was very calm. It was kind of like someone going about a workmanlike job, hammering nails in something or laying bricks and getting the mortars spread properly. It was very focused, very calm, and very purposeful, and kind of even tempered towards everybody involved, even the wildest people who were complaining to him. He would meet with them, hear them out. He would not read all the horrible, god-awful memos people sent to him every day, but he would meet with them and try to talk it out. That was his mode of dealing with a lot of different issues and groups of people that were agitated back then, because it was during the Vietnam War era, so there was a lot of political ferment going on, and especially with Hair, because it was about young people during the Vietnam era and their feelings. So he found a way to deal with those kinds of issues, both artistic and societal, in somewhat the same manner.
I liked that. I was going to bring that up because coming from theater, it's that total, almost near train wreck, as you said.
Yeah, right.
He dealt with everybody individually, face to face dialogue,
right,
conversation, and I really feel like dialogue is the best bridge. And
absolutely,
he's been a master of dialogue and communication.
He was a producer, but he wasn't a remote person. He was never a remote person in the organization ever. He touched base with everybody, and he heard everybody out who wanted to be heard, that was involved in a production or in a staff or whatever it was. He was very approachable that way.
Well, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
How was his approach? And you open the book, you're taking notes for a rehearsal of a play in the park before the public theater opened, the brick and mortar building, when it was free theater. What was his approach in directing actors, in like if something wasn't going well, or maybe it's a director or someone, but what was his approach in that?
Well, the first play that he directed that I took notes for was this play by Shakespeare, Troilus and Cressida. And the wonderful young actor who was playing Troilus had certain ideas about the character that Joe didn't really share. But Joe, as a director, didn't voice his opinion to the actor because he felt that would be incorrect. He didn't want to intervene in the actor's own process. So he instead had a private chat with him in which he pointed out certain lines that he had in the play and examined them with him. And when the actor kind of looked more closely at these lines, he realized, oh, well, this guy's not the perfect person, you know, that a lot of people think he's supposed to be. He's a little different. So Joe got the actor to look at certain aspects of his own character just by examining these lines a little more closely. He was a good director. Joe thought he was in the kind of the middle range of good directing. You know, I didn't think he was particularly outstanding or a great director, but he enjoyed directing a lot, and he was wonderful with actors, absolutely wonderful, very supportive, and he enjoyed actors so much. You know, they just all felt that, and so he had his own way of trying to coax them into doing their very best. And he always felt, he said this about George C. Scott, for instance, when we directed quite a bit in the very, very early days. He said, you just create a kind of a space and an open feeling about the play that surrounds the actor, and you support that. And he said, you don't really have to do too much for the good actor. A good actor will rise to the occasion and find their place within the inviting space of a production. So that was the way he went about directing for the most part.
Did he ever lose his temper or get frustrated? Because he's so strong, but I never, in all these interviews that I saw and in things that I've read, I never really saw him get irritable, and he certainly had reason to be frustrated.
Right. No, he could get angry. He could get angry, but he didn't show that in public. You know, in interviews and stuff. He was even-tempered in the way he talked about things that would come up in interviews, for instance. But he could get angry, of course. But he was aware that, you know, he was in the public eye so much. He wasn't going to, you know, really show that aspect of him. Nevertheless, he was viewed by the media in his day as an arrogant and a strong-willed and difficult person. That was the media's take
for
on
what he wanted, because he fought for what he wanted.
Yeah. Feisty was a very famous, wonderful word. Everybody used feisty for 2 generations in the press. Arrogant was another very favorite word. There's certain favorite words that continued for 3 generations during Joe's life in the theater that the media used. I think they just picked it up from each other or whatever.
Yeah, I was going to say they probably just copycatted what somebody else said. So as what I think the other thing, and I mentioned this at the top, that I personally was so fond of was the relationship that you had. You all had a long working relationship for several years before you finally married. And I feel like it was a relationship that was bred from a common love and a common respect for a common mission together. So how did that make you feel when people were, you know, you're seeing the man you love on a bus going by, or you're hearing him being talked about this way? I mean, you knew the real person, but how is it like to be the partner?
Well, it was wonderful. It was unexpected and it was wonderful. But when Joe was criticized, you know, in certain ways in the press, that initially upset me quite a bit. But then, you know, I compared it a little bit to, say, you know, a relative of someone who's in political life and they get, you know, castigated and argued against and misrepresented or whatever. But if you're in the public eye, you can't just fall apart and start, you know, criticizing everybody in sight. You have a public role, and you have to understand that, and you have to be able to handle that kind of stuff that's maybe coming at somebody that you care a great deal about. So that's what I understood from the beginning, and so I learned how to handle my own feelings with respect to it.
Mm.
And put them in some perspective and realize, well, I'm not going to fall apart in front of everybody, tear my hair out because I feel so angry about something. I'll just never do that in public. So I didn't.
They're hard. So what's it like to work and live day in and day out with your business partner, who also happens to be your life partner, who you love?
Right. Well, there was no separation between our personal and professional life, really. Very, very little separation. We worked at home, we worked at the office. It was all kind of a piece. It doesn't mean we didn't have personal interests and so forth. Yeah, we certainly had a personal life because Joe's youngest son lived with us. And I was his stepmother from the time he was 12 years old, and I take care of his schooling and so forth. And there were many aspects that were going on that were purely personal. But the interesting thing is that when you become involved in an idea that has a lot of strength and importance to your life together that you both share, it's just part of your life. It's a natural part of your life. So the idea of separation of work and a personal life isn't the same. It's different. Other people have work that's really just totally different than their personal life or life at home. And the two things are kind of in opposition to each other. That wasn't the case with us. I think it may have been the case with his two youngest children, who felt, his preoccupation with the theater took away something from them. So that's a different story. But in terms of myself and Joe, it was never something that took away from our life together. The two things were all of a piece and together all the time, which is interesting.
Yeah, and it's a wonderful love story. It really is it's a wonderful love story. And I think you're very fortunate in that you both were able to work together in this shared mission that was quite bigger than the both of you.
Yeah.
Do you think he realized, or at one point did you realize that it was truly a mission? It was his idea, but it became this huge mission. Did it suddenly come upon you one day when you just went, oh, or, what did that feel like? Because it's a huge kind of responsibility when you walk into that big building and there's all those theaters and there's hair and there's Hamilton came up from the public and all of these, George C. Wolfe, all these amazing directors and actors and plays. What does that feel like when you turn? I mean, I guess you don't really stop when you're in the thick of things and go, wow, look what I've done. But how does that feel?
Well, I'll tell you that the way I felt going to work every day, it was like a second home. I felt that my theatrical home was at the public theater and also in the park, of course, but the one we went to every day was the public theater. And so it just seemed like an extension of my life from home, and with all these marvelous people involved in their work there. So I felt very comfortable in the place. And I knew so many of the people. We worked together from the very early days. So I had those relationships with them. And it was very congenial. When the organization got larger, it changed a little bit. But, and I don't think I could ever have worked in a very large organization at that point in my life. There was something that, because it was a small institution, if you want to call it that, and it had such a personal feeling to its origins and the way that Joe related to people, it didn't seem overpowering. And But if it had been a very large institution, I could never work my way into it, I don't think.
Sure. Well, I think it's one of those things you all created it from your energy and from your desire, as you said earlier. It was really his passion, and
yes, absolutely.
It's a wonderful story. I want to close right now, but I encourage everyone to read Public Private: My Life with Joe Papp at the Public Theater by the lovely Gail Merrifield Papp. Her business life and her love life with a most magnanimous and wonderful man. And I'm eternally grateful that you shared the story with us now for those of us in this generation who need these lessons. It's whether it's theater or a nonprofit organization or just human relationships.
Thank you.
A wonderful book. So thank you so much. And the book is available everywhere books are sold. So I just want to thank you so much, Gail, for being with us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Wonderful to be here and talk to you.
Thank you, ma'am. Take care.
You too. You too.